Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trails and Greenways conference session presenting the Great Redwood Trail Feasibility Assessment. My name is Curtis Alling. I am a principal with Ascent Environmental and was project director for the feasibility assessment for the consultant team. Our topic today is to share with you the approach and the outcome of the analysis that was conducted by California State Parks for the California State Transportation Agency and California Natural Resources Agency to examine the feasibility of a major interregional trail from the northern parts of the Bay Area to Humboldt County. Next slide, please. Let me start by a few introductions. Our first speaker today will be Jason Spann. He's an associate landscape architect in the Strategic Planning and Recreation Services Division of California State Parks. He's a registered landscape architect and specializes in road and trail planning, design, and management. His experience includes greenways, road and trail management plans, recreational trail development and rehabilitation, and road to trail conversions. And he served as California State Parks project manager for the feasibility assessment. After Jason, Nanette Hansel will speak. She is a senior project manager and senior environmental planner with Ascent Environmental. She's led major transportation and trail planning and environmental review projects, mostly in the Lake Tahoe Basin where she's based, and including the new gem of basin trails, the Lake Tahoe East Shore Trail. She served as the feasibility studies overall project manager for the consultant team and led the evaluation of environmental constraints and development of the feasibility conclusions. And then finally, we'll have Devin Young. He's vice president and design principal with Alta Planning and Design. He's a professional landscape architect and experienced project manager. He's helped lead large trail pathway improvement projects like the Los Angeles River Path and the Coachella Valley Link. His technical skills are combining creativity with a practical ability to find common ground when facing complex infrastructure challenges. He led the elements of the feasibility assessment involving trail design types, governance review, and trail demand and use analysis. With that introduction, we will head into our presentation. If you have questions about our presentation, please enter them using the Q&A box. And then at the end, we'll have a live question and answer session. Okay, I'll turn it over to Jason to begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Curtis. I'm going to give a rather brief overview of the history of the rail corridor. The extended history is rather complex, and I don't want to get too much into the details of it because I really want to save the bulk of the presentation for the trail assessment itself. But we'll provide kind of an overview and some context to the assessment. The Northwestern Pacific Railroad was established in the late 1800s, and it essentially went from San Francisco up to the small lumber town of Corbell, which is located near Arcata and Eureka. And the purpose of the rail line was primarily to transport lumber, redwood from the North Coast down to San Francisco for distribution, and also to transport passengers up to the ever-growing lumber towns along the North Coast and then back to San Francisco. And this line operated by private companies until the 1980s, when for various reasons the timber industry really started to decline. Then in 1989, there was an effort by the California legislature to really preserve the rail line, and they enacted the North Coast Rail Authority Act, which created the North Coast Rail Authority, otherwise known as the NCRA. We'll be referring to that in this presentation. And I don't know how many of you were around in the 1998, but the winter of 1998 was a severe storm year, and it caused a lot of damage to all along the rail line, really from Windsor all the way up to Arcata, essentially closing rail service down. And without the economic viability of transporting the lumber anymore, there really was no incentive to reestablish those lines. So after about 20 years with no operable railroad, Senator Mike McGuire proposed Senate Bill 1029 in 2018. And essentially what the bill required was that the California Transportation Agency, along with the California Natural Resources Agency, was to conduct an assessment of NCRA. And the purpose of that was really to try to determine the best way to dissolve NCRA eventually, and also to assess the viability of constructing a trail along their corridor, which is what we're really talking about today. And what the California Transportation Agency and the Natural Resources Agency did was they sought help from the California Department of Transportation, California State Parks, Department of General Services, and Department of Finance in this effort. And those findings that came from that report were presented to the legislature in October 2020. And the responsibilities of the agencies were that DGS was really looking at assessing the property, the NCRA's property, their easements, their right-of-ways. Department of Finance was really looking at their NCRA's debts and assets and liabilities. And Caltrans was really looking at and negotiating the options for transferring the southern portion of the rail line of NCRA's property to the Sonoma Marin Area Rail Transit District, who would then take that over and utilize that for passenger services. And then California State Parks was looking at the assessing the viability of the trail, of the corridor for a trail. And California State Parks then contracted with Alta, who then contracted with Ascent, who then subcontracted with Alta to assist in this endeavor. And I'm just going to give a real kind of overview of the rail network in the area, just to give you a little bit of context. You can see the red line, which is the NCRA property right-of-way, and is what we're really talking about today. And you can also see in orange, there's the skunk train that many of you may be familiar with. It's a recreational passenger service from Willits to Fort Bragg. And then towards the bottom, you see the blue lines showing the SMART operated rail. And then there's some California Northern rail in yellow. And then the Napa Valley Wine Train you see as a small green line to the right. So. And the purpose of the feasibility study was really to inform the legislature about the factors affecting the feasibility of trail development, give them a sense of really how feasible this was so that they could then make decisions on how best to move forward. And part of that was to identify portions of the corridor that may be more or less viable for trail development. And looking at, if this trail was built, what would the use demand be? And then also developing kind of overriding planning estimates to get a general idea of what the cost is that we'd be looking at to make a trail happen. And then to also identify, where priorities might be and how we might be able to phase this in given those priorities. And part of the assessment was breaking it down really into two sections. And one would be what we would refer to as the northern section, which goes from approximately Cloverdale north up to the Eureka, Arcata area. And in this portion, we were really looking at a rail to trail evaluation where we'd actually be removing the tracks and then utilizing the rail prism as a trail. And then from Cloverdale down to Healdsburg, we were looking at a rail with trail option because the thought is that SMART is going to take over this and use it for passenger service. So we would actually have a trail that would be paralleling the rail line. Some of the criteria we wanted to look at as part of the assessment was the natural resources opportunities and constraints, looking at cultural resource opportunities and constraints such as archaeological, historical, and tribal resources, the infrastructure conditions such as the tunnels and trestles and bridges along the railway, geologic conditions, primarily landslides, railroad debris and hazardous materials that have been left behind over 100 some odd years as being operated as a rail line, looking at the right-of-way and encroachment issues that might be prohibitive to getting a trail through the corridor, determining where public access availability would be, and trying to get an idea of what the anticipated trail use might be along sections of the trail. And also looking at adjacent scenic and recreational opportunities, assessing what attributes would be attractive for visitors to come. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to Nanette to really talk about the assessment and the findings.
With that background in mind, the team set out first to complete an existing conditions inventory. The inventory was largely based on existing information that was available through NCRA, Caltrans, and the Department of General Services, our own literature review, and field assessments. The field assessment for a 252-mile corridor was by itself a major undertaking. We marshaled the forces, split the corridor into 3 sections, and sent 3 independent field teams out to initiate the assessment. To ensure that inventory methods were consistent across the teams, a survey form and corridor assessment rubric was developed. A training day was held in the field so that we could make sure that 3 teams would use a consistent approach to assessing conditions and to refine the survey tools that we developed. Field crews used georeferenced photographs to document conditions throughout the corridor. Just some of the items that were inventoried in the field and documented in the report include adjacent land uses that could pose compatibility issues or that could provide an opportunity to support trail use, encroachments within the corridor, depots and yards, or at least what's left of them, other rail infrastructure such as bridges, tunnels, large culverts, and milepost markers, at-grade crossings, environmental conditions, including geologic conditions, hazardous materials and environmental contaminants, natural and biological resources, cultural resources, and potential utility conflicts. And finally, the field crews looked at potential access points and trail connections. For the purposes of describing existing conditions in the assessment, the rail corridor was divided into 5 sections based on major geospatial characteristics. Those sections are shown here and include a southern rail with trail section, a southern rail to trail section, an Eel River Canyon section, a northern section, and a section that included 3 branches off the main line. I'll take a moment to highlight some of the key constraints that we found in the field. As already mentioned, we documented geologic conditions along the length of the corridor, and the Eel River Canyon section and the southern portion of the northern section are located in steep terrain that is subject to slope failure. The seismically active terrain exacerbates these issues. It's also likely that retrofits may be required for structures throughout the corridor to meet current seismic standards. These photos illustrate the types of encroachments we found. We documented more than 50 locations with major or minor encroachments. I'll note that these photos are taken from roughly the center line of the corridor, and they show that some encroachments are quite significant and completely block the trail corridor. Field crews assessed the condition of 84 bridges in the corridor. 51 of the bridges were found to be in good condition or generally intact. 19 have some form of visible damage. 9 are partially or fully collapsed. And 5 bridges have only pilings or remnants remaining of the original structure. With respect to wood trestles, many look to be in good condition, as shown on the left, but especially in the northern, wetter areas, upon closer inspection, they're truly in poor condition with rotting timbers. The photo on the right shows an example of a former trestle where only remnants remain. It also shows how overgrown the corridor is at some locations and just how challenging walking the corridor was for the field crews. Generally speaking, the concrete or steel bridges seem to be in better condition than the trestles, as shown here for the Island Mountain Bridge over the Eel River and the bridge over Larrabee Creek. We also inventoried retaining walls. And here's an example of a failing wall, which is indicative of many walls within the corridor. There are 30 tunnels within the corridor, 21 of which are in the Eel River Canyon alone. Tunnel lengths vary between 100 feet and more than 3/4 of a mile. Of the 30 tunnels we assessed, 17 were found to be in good condition or generally intact, 8 were partially collapsed, and 5 were fully collapsed. We used the State Water Resources Control Board's GeoTracker and the Department of Toxic Substances Control's EnviroStore databases to initially identify known sites of contamination. We also inventoried abandoned rail equipment that poses a contamination hazard while in the field. The field assessment crews found 47 locations where 1 or more rail cars have been abandoned on or near the tracks. And 8 of those locations include situations that involve multiple rail cars. Of the 113 locations where hazardous materials were documented, 60 locations contain noteworthy quantities of hazardous materials. Once the existing conditions inventory was complete, we used that information to divide the corridor into 57 segments based on access connections. Each segment begins and ends at a potential trail access point and provides independent utility. Segment lengths vary between 2 and 19 miles. The features that were assessed in the existing conditions inventory were then divided into both opportunities and constraints, and they were assigned a score using a weighting criteria based on the feature's relative opportunity or constraint. Composite scores were calculated for each of the 57 trail segments. Next slide. And here you can see an overview of the segment breakdown and an illustration of the relative score given to each segment. Segments that are shown in red have the most constraints, whereas segments shown in green are those that are least constrained. The area shown in red towards the center of the map here reflects the stretch through the Eel River Canyon. Devin, in his part of today's presentation, will hit on a few other aspects of the feasibility assessment, but for now, I'm going to jump into some of the key assessment findings. Starting with acknowledging that the corridor contains significant feasibility challenges in certain locations. The assessment found that the major constraints that most influence trail feasibility include geomorphic challenges, including landslides and high-risk slopes, large right-of-way encroachments, especially those that may be legally authorized, failing infrastructure such as collapsed bridges and tunnels, and previous contamination and hazardous waste sites to the extent that they require costly remediation. The presence of wetlands and special status species, historic structures, areas of archaeological sensitivity, and tribal lands are also constraints. These factors influence the time and cost to implement the trail, particularly if extensive permitting, trail reroutes, or compensatory mitigation would be required. The Eel River Canyon poses unique opportunities and constraints. Its greatest constraints are related to the difficult geophysical conditions in the canyon and the extensive, dilapidated, and unmaintained infrastructure. The area is isolated and rugged, has limited access, and the slopes are unstable. That said, an estimated 75% or more of the canyon's length is in good physical condition and includes gentle grades suitable for trail development. This section of the trail would also offer some of the most spectacular views of the entire corridor, consistent with the scenic views and values reflected in its wild and scenic river designation. Recognizing the complexity of the Eel River Canyon section, the assessment found that a narrower, soft surface trail may be more readily developed and maintained over time as compared to, say, Class 1 hard surface trail. The corridor's gentle grades lend themselves to development of an interregional trail that would provide outdoor recreation and active transportation experiences for its trail users. The trail would also connect Northern California communities from the Bay Area to the North Coast. Planning level cost estimates for fully developing the trail were estimated at $750 million in 2020 dollars, a pretty significant cost. I'll note that the assessment was focused on repurposing the North Coast Rail Authority corridor, but we found that potential trail reroutes could translate into a cost savings of up to $85 million. On the flip side, it was also found that if the trail were fully developed, it could generate an estimated $24 million in annual local economic activity. Based on the inventory features and results of the condition and user demand assessments, the assessment found that the rail corridor could be divided into 4 logical phases as shown here. These phases represent grouped segments of near-term, mid-term, and long-term implementation priorities. And I'll conclude my portion of the presentation with identifying the sections that the assessment found to be most feasible to be developed, which include the southernmost rail with trail section in Sonoma County between Healdsburg and Cloverdale, which could be implemented in connection with SMART's plans to develop passenger service to Cloverdale. The segments located near the communities in Mendocino County. And finally, the Humboldt County segments from the Ferndale area to just north of Arcata. And with that, we'll move on and turn it over to Devin to highlight some of the key features of the assessment.
So Nanette identified parts of the corridor that's very rugged. And as you can see from all of our Zoom backgrounds, it's also very beautiful as well. So in order to adequately or appropriately navigate a corridor this complex, it's really critical to develop a series of trail typologies or trail types, because the natural and developed environment, it does vary greatly along the entire length of the corridor. the corridor traverses populated areas and long stretches of rural areas. There's also rail with trail, as Nanette and Jason both pointed out. And then as Nanette also showed some great images of and identified unstable slopes, moderate slopes, lowland areas with creeks that need to be crossed, culverts that have been largely blown out and are no longer intact, which results in appropriate typologies that can navigate those complex conditions like elevated trail types, bench trail types, cantilevered trail types, as well as either building new structures or retrofitting some of the existing structures along the corridor like bridges, tunnels, and culverts. So to begin looking at trail types, it's really important to think about this corridor as it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It frankly can't be. It's hundreds of miles long, navigates through a range of different environments, and also, as Nanette pointed out, and we'll talk about briefly here in a moment, provides different demand estimates. There's just going to be more people on some and fewer on others. So what you're seeing up on the screen here is on the left is this notion of a more urban environment, Great Redwood Trail, where it would be hard surface, like Nanette mentioned, kind of a class 1 facility that offers both transportation as well as recreation. It may even have an adjacent soft surface side path to accommodate pedestrians or even equestrians in some of those higher density areas. But then it's important to partner that trail typology or the trail cross section with a more rural condition where it could potentially be 4 to 6 feet wide and be able to navigate some of these more complex terrains. As Nanette pointed out, in the Eel River Canyon, for instance, could be a great candidate to go with a softer surface or a soft surface trail that's narrower and a little bit more flexible, a little bit more nimble to adapt to that environment. We also, as Jason pointed out in one of his first slides, the rail with trail versus rail to trail component. We need to consider this rail with trail type, where there's existing active freight as well as transportation rail or rail for transportation purposes that needs to still accommodate those uses as well as the trail. So what we have here is a rail with trail cross section with adequate barriers between the trail and the rail service so that it can functionally navigate with an existing freight as well as transportation rail line. So image on the left there is a great example. Nanette showed some good ones as well. Lots of unstable slopes in certain areas along the corridor. And you can see this, there's a range of different ways that we can navigate these conditions. This is a very short section. I mean, Nanette showed some images of thousands of feet of unstable slopes. So the idea of building a pile supported or a pile driven bench trail or an elevated trail type is something that's really important so that you can navigate these complex conditions and keep a trail that's intact and usable year round. But largely in and along the corridor, there are existing benched areas that are moderately stable or very stable slopes. And by expanding some of those existing benched areas and laying back kind of the upland side as well as the down, the lowland side to accommodate a trail, maybe a very cost-effective way to navigate several conditions. As you can see, this kind of balanced cut fill approach on the left. But we do anticipate these short stretches of really challenging areas. So it could be a combination of a balanced cut fill, and then when we navigate towards an existing rock face or a really unstable slope condition, potentially a cantilever structure like we see here on the right may be most appropriate. And a great example of what once was a functional culvert. You can see the existing rail line above and the remnant of what was once existing culvert, and the idea of having a trail type available to you that includes either reconstructing an existing culvert, maybe doing a short span bridge, or navigating down to the existing lowland creek and providing potentially an elevated boardwalk condition. These are all appropriate and important trail types to kind of have in your back pocket so that we can navigate these complex conditions. And then bridges, trestles, tunnels. So Nanette mentioned that there's several bridges and tunnels that are intact. There are others that look like what you see here on the left. And so making sure that we're accommodating both and identifying is it most appropriate to reconstruct that existing tunnel or potentially go around it. And then the same thing with bridges. Nanette pointed out some of the decaying trestles. However, there are several bridge structures that are intact and maybe just need some additional features like guardrail and additional surface treatments to accommodate a trail. So making sure that we have both the retrofit as well as the new construction in our kind of suite of trail types is critical. And at-grade crossings. At-grade crossings, there's lots of instances where a grade-separated crossing just doesn't make sense from a cost perspective, as well as just a volume perspective in terms of the perpendicular roadway that the corridor is crossing. And making sure that we included in this feasibility assessment things like signalized crossings or rapid rectangular flashing beacon crossings is really important. And also access points. Where we have these trail crossings, those provide great opportunities for people to get on and off the trail. And this trail is going to be a marquee feature in Northern California. And so providing appropriate things like picnic shelters or wayfinding, restrooms in certain locations could make a lot of sense as we think about people getting on and off the corridor and really enticing people to get on and off the corridor safely and effectively. And lastly, I'll end here too. Nanette pointed out some of the cost savings about reroute or by completing reroutes. And that's something that's important to point out. There's a lot of intact corridor to use. However, in some instances, it just may make the most sense to actually reroute around some of those challenging areas. And that may be providing a new structure crossing over to the other side of the river, or tying into an existing roadway and using a trail type like a side path, which could be much more cost effective and help us navigate some of these really challenging areas. So this is just a quick look at the range of trail types. The full suite of trail types are in the feasibility assessment, but I think it's just important to point out this notion of there's no one size fits all along a corridor that's this long and this complex. And so we developed a range of different trail types to accommodate the complexity of the corridor. And Nanette closed on one of her slides, which looked at trail demand and prioritization. So one of the most important things whenever we look at these long corridor assessments is to get a sense of kind of how many people are going to be using it, when they're going to be using it, and where kind of the most densely used areas are going to be. So as part of this feasibility assessment, we looked at the corridor using the Alta Trail Demand Model, as well as the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, the NCHRP model, which are our origin destination models that start to get at demand that relates to each individual segment. Nanette mentioned these 5 segments. We looked at the entirety of the corridor and then broke it down into individual segments as well. So we could start to get a sense of kind of, as I mentioned, how many, where, and start to answer those questions. And the results are, if fully completed, the Great Redwood Trail is estimated to attract approximately 1.4 million annual trail users. That's about 3,800 users per day. And that's a sizable number. To give you a sense, some comparative trails, the Empire State Trail in New York, which is 750 miles, they have around 8 million annual users. It's a longer trail, goes through denser areas. Versus the Katy Trail in Missouri, which is about 240 miles, and they receive around 400,000 users annually. And it's important to get a sense of both those trail types and where Great Redwood Trail would fall in between there. So it's a significant number of users, and with that significant number of users come a range of benefits as well, which we'll discuss. This is just a snapshot of those daily users. And I think what's really important to point out here is not necessarily the daily users by individual segment, but the estimated demand density. I mentioned at the very outset these trail cross sections and doing a hard surface trail versus a narrower soft surface trail. And it really gets at the estimated demand density per mile. The more users per mile, kind of the greater need for a wider trail type. And so you can see that railway trail section down in the south, so between Healdsburg, Cloverdale area, larger density of users, 53 versus the Rail 2 Trail Eel River Canyon section, which you're looking at kind of the 1 to 55 daily users, and that would be more of a long distance trail environment, would lend itself better to potentially a soft surface trail. So it's important to look at these trail demand in terms of just total volume, total number of users, but also the density of users along each segment. And then we take those numbers, and this is just a snapshot of what the potential benefits are, but we take those numbers and translate them into what would be the total number of new biking and walking trips. And it's, you know, it's no small amount. I mentioned the 1.4 million annually. And how does that then translate to fewer vehicle trips per year? And you're looking, when you take around a replacement ratio of around 69% for biking trips and around 30% for walking trips, you're seeing 708,000 fewer vehicular trips. And that translates into, you know, 1.580 metric tons of CO2 emissions saved. So you can start to see some real tangible benefits coming out of implementing this trail that really support a range of different environmental needs as well as social benefits. And the last component too, and I'll just do a selfless plug here, because if you really want to get into the weeds of trail governance, I highly recommend you joining Jason and I later in the conference, where we'll be doing a session dedicated to trail governance, because it's an important component of not only the Great Redwood Trail corridor, but really all trail corridors that are new or are transitioning from a rail corridor to a trail corridor. The feasibility assessment looked at a range of different governance structures that could be implemented along the corridor and identified some of the trade-offs within those structures. But what's critical about any governance structure that's implemented for a trail like the Great Redwood Trail is that it needs to be able to identify funding opportunities, administer funds, coordinate with partner agencies, organizations, oversee planning, design, construction, manage contractors during implementation as well as the operations, and you know, oversee the overarching O&M or operations and maintenance in an ongoing basis. So those were kind of key elements that were considered when we were looking at trail governance for the Great Redwood Trail. And we started looking at trail governance by doing a policy field review. It's important to identify federal, state, local requirements, as well as just the way these individual agencies could be responsive to the operations and governance of a trail like the Great Redwood Trail. And so I won't go into great detail, but as far as all the individual agencies and entities, but what I just wanted to point out is you can see at a federal level, there's a range of entities that have responsibilities tied to a corridor like this at the state level, at the local level. And then there's also tribal interests, nonprofit organizations, there's existing railroad industry partners, as well as just a range of communities along the corridors that are unincorporated and all have vested interest in a corridor like this and would need to be a part of any budding governance structure. So what we did as part of the feasibility assessment is we identified a range of potential management structures. And then when I mentioned getting at trade-offs, looked at kind of a range of the pros and cons, or kind of a level of benefit or trade-off associated with each structure. So you can see on the left there, everything from a single government organization, like a state agency, down to nonprofit organization, multi-agency cooperative agreement, joint powers authority, commission, special district. As you can see, if you navigate over to the right, you know, all of these respond to things like how does it accommodate a multi-jurisdictional trail, or how could it, or what would the implementation timeframe be if a structure like this was in place for the Great Redwood Trail, to consistency, design standards. Are there existing design standards within these entities currently, or would design standards need to be developed? So you can see each one kind of responds to a large, long, multi-jurisdictional trail a little bit differently. So it's important to lay out all of those as we considered governance for the Great Redwood Trail. And before we jumped into, I'll go through a series of case studies that were looked at for the Great Redwood Trail feasibility assessment. Before we jumped into that, though, it was really important to take a look at what the existing management structure along the NCRA corridor currently is. And you can see it's established as the North Coast Railroad Authority, that is executive director, administrative assistant, and the funding really flows through that authority. And then that authority is really governed by an overarching board of directors that have separate board committees or task force initiatives. And that authority then directly manages a series of on-call contracts to do things like resident engineering, all the way to transportation planning, legal counsel, and accounting. So transitioning away from that existing structure, we looked at three different case studies. So this one, the Columbia Plateau State Park, is a good example of that, where the Washington State Park is actually the trail operator. And so you can see this is an existing agency entity that oversees the planning, design, maintenance, as well as overall coordination. And that agency then has individual cooperative agreement with the local entities that the trail passes through. So local jurisdictions help with private funding, but the bulk of the funding comes through that existing agency that then goes out and operates and maintains the trail. Versus a case study like the San Dieguito River Valley, which is a joint powers authority. And although this is an open space project, there is a large trail component to it. And so you can see there's the JPA that is essentially running and administering the trail, and it's overseen by a board of directors that has county interests as well as the local city interests. But that JPA also has cooperative agreements with local jurisdictions. So you can see the way the funding goes. The local entities are collecting funds, and then the JPA is the overall operator. And finally, the East Coast Greenway Alliance, this is a nonprofit example where you can see there's a fundamental difference between the JPA or the state agency. The East Coast Greenway Alliance is the nonprofit that's overseeing coordination, programming, fundraising, but really the implementation and the O&M is completed at the local level. So there's cooperative agreements in place, and those local entities are going out and seeking funding and trying to implement sections of the East Coast Greenway. So that's just three examples of various case studies, or three various case studies, examples of governance structures that work along large corridor projects. And so these were all considered as part of the Great Redwood Trail. So those just a broad look, and then I'll go ahead and pass it over to Jason to kind of zoom us in and talk through next steps.
Great, thanks, Devin. I did want to talk briefly about the next steps that were identified in the report to the legislature. One of those was that statutory changes would be required to actually dissolve the NCRA and set a clear path forward for the corridor. NCRA was created through legislation and probably would need to then be dissolved through a similar method. Also, legislation would be needed to clarify whether the right-of-way should be liquidated, sold to another railroad company, or, as we're discussing, converted to the Great Redwood Trail. And if it was converted to the Great Redwood Trail, then determining a successor trail agency or organization kind of ties into what Devin was discussing previously regarding trail governance. And currently what's occurring is that NCRA is currently in the process of railway abandonment from Willits to Arcata, the area, the line marked in red, and then rail banking of that section. That is currently going on. The area in green from Willits to the county line is currently going to be retained by NCRA because there's still some questions about whether or not there is desire to keep the rail line through that area. So that's kind of ongoing negotiations associated with that. The line mark in blue from county line to Healdsburg roughly would be, is currently being transferred to SMART. And then the location at the bottom in the tan would be the freight easements would be transferred from NCRA to SMART. There's also currently Senate Bill 69, which is also being sponsored by Senator Mike McGuire, and that's in progress. I think it's going through some revisions, but some of the things it says is that, you know, it would establish the Great Wood Trail designation in the northern section, and it would define a transitory trail governance structure kind of to deal with getting through the rail banking process. And then, as I stated earlier, kind of completion of transferring the rights of the southern section to SMART. So that's what's currently happening. There's certainly more to come. And I look forward to seeing what's going on in that regard. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis to close us out.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Devin and Annette, and to our audience. Thank you for your attention today. We hope that you found the assessment methods and the evaluation strategies to be informative for this interregional trail.